welcome to our listeners. Joining us in this episode is Baukje. Hi.
Hi.
Where did life begin for you?
I'm now a professor in nutrition, but life began in the Netherlands, and you will hear that from my voice. It started in a small place in Friesland, up north in the Netherlands, a place where we didn't eat a lot of fish. So it is quite interesting that in the end my career went in that direction. It was a small farming community. Grew up kind of small school, went to secondary school, and then went to university in Wageningen University, and that was really the only agricultural university at that place. Very forward-looking, so a lot of the concepts I'm looking now at was already discussed then, kind of healthy diets, but also climate change and all these things that have become really important. Also become really important in the context of seafood. So I was in the Netherlands up till I was 28, and then I came to Scotland, and I've been here ever since.
I've been a lot of times in Holland, and I always felt they had a super healthy diet.
Actually, we are not eating that much seafood. We are known for eating the herring, and we market that really well. I remember eating eel when I was a small child, but we didn't eat a lot of fish. My parents didn't eat fish. I think together the Netherlands and Germany have actually one of the lowest levels of seafood consumption in Europe. So although we, like Scotland, produce a lot of seafood, we export quite a lot. And if you look at dietary recommendations for fish consumption in the Netherlands, they've actually lowered them because they felt that most people felt they couldn't achieve those dietary guidelines. So yes, we do eat fish, but perhaps not as much as we should in the Netherlands. And I think perhaps even in the UK, we're not eating an awful lot of fish in the UK either, but we're eating more in the UK than we probably eat in the Netherlands.
So where did you study?
So I studied in Wageningen, and I studied human nutrition, and I found diets fascinating. At the moment, the statistics are that diet is actually contributing 20 to 25% of all adult deaths. So, and that is often due to poor diet, and that could be not eating enough or eating too much of not good things. So diet is important for health, but increasingly diet is very important for global greenhouse emissions as well. So our whole food system is responsible for a third of greenhouse gas emissions. So from that perspective, food is really central in what we should be looking at in terms of health, in terms of greenhouse gas emission, and there's lots of things to improve on. And that fascinated me then, it fascinates me now. And it's also not an easy field. We don't have golden bullets. Oh, just eat something of this, just eat fish oil supplements and you will be healthy. It doesn't work like that, right? It's really about diets. It's about whole diets. And that's why fish is also so important rather than fish oil supplements. It's about how we improve diets, but also make that acceptable to the population so they stick to the dietary recommendation.
Lots to think about and speak about there. And where are you actually working now?
So now I'm working at the University of Aberdeen at the Rowett Institute. The Rowett Institute has been around for a long time, more than 100 years, and topics of research have changed. We used to kind of look initially at dietary intake before the Second World War, and actually that research has been the basis for the food rationing during the Second World War. But then as we came out of the war, we didn't have enough food for everyone, so the research was really focusing on production systems. How could we get more meat out of cows or sheep or lamb or pork, for example? How could we make that production system more efficient? And it was focusing very much on animal health and animal production. But then since the 80s, obesity became very important, and we increasingly found that our diets were perhaps not as healthy as we thought and were the culprit for the development of diseases like heart disease and cancer. So at the moment, the Rowett is very much focusing on healthy diets, but also sustainable diets, right? We still need to make enough food in 30 years' time when we are with many more people, and the climate is starting to have an impact on the foods we can produce, and how does it affect what we import, what we export, so more generally food systems. So the Rowett has really been at the forefront of nutrition for a long time, and I joined in 2001, and I pretty much started with seafood research from that point onwards. So I've been working in this area for almost 2 decades now.
If I could take you back a bit, what is you call it the Wageningen?
Yes, Wageningen University.
Oh, it's a university, because I had a recent podcast with a Natalie Steins, who is with ICES, like a fisheries scientist with ICES. And it's just, that's where she was based. So it's obviously a university.
Yeah, it used to be, I suppose, what we would call a polytechnic university, and then it became a proper university. And interestingly, just before I joined the university in 1988, it's a long time ago, or actually just when I had joined, they had to change the name because it was Agricultural University. And the Agricultural University did actually not attract students because it was agriculture. It was not very fashionable. It was not very sexy. So it became Wageningen University because they wanted to give a more general feeling to it being a university. And I think now it has been the most popular university in the past 5 to 10 years. And it shows also how agriculture has become really topical and really timely to study, because it can, I think we need the knowledge, we need the insights to solve a lot of big problems in the future. So the agricultural universities or the colleges are increasingly getting very important for solving our big global problems.
Yeah, that's quite clever. Just changing the name. It reminds me of
Exactly.
when I had the restaurant. My menu is 100% fish and seafood, and if something wasn't moving, rather than change the dish, I would change how I wrote it on the menu.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, and I think now we get students from all over the place, and the people involved in research, they have coming from very different disciplines, and that's what we need. I'm now a professor in nutrition, but I work with people that are coming from mathematics, from sociology, from agriculture, very, very different disciplines, and we all work together on doing the research.
How much scientific work has there been done on the nutritional value of seafood in our diet?
We have been obviously aware of the composition of seafood for a long time. I don't think we. So what happens is we do research in which macronutrients or carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are in fish, how much, and which micronutrients fit which vitamins. And we then create databases. And we have a database for the UK. It's not as good as the Norwegian one. I think we lack quite a like the databases is based on the most commonly consumed fish species, but obviously we're not eating as much fish as they do in Norway, so the databases are much more extensive in Norway. But we have these databases. We then use the databases to see kind of if we eat certain foods and we eat a certain amount of these foods, how much of the nutrients do we take in? And then subsequently, when we have that information, we look at if people are eating this amount of fish, and so theoretically they would get this amount of omega-3 fatty acids, or would get this amount of vitamin D, for example. Fish is one of our most important sources of vitamin D. And we can just look at health outcomes and disease outcomes, or even mortality. We can see, is fish consumption linked to mortality, to dying? So yes, we are using the nutritional value of fish for a long time. The research in fish really started in the 1970s when two researchers called Bang and Dyerberg found that in Greenland, the Inuit population actually had much lower levels of stroke, of heart disease, and of death from these two conditions. And they suspected perhaps it is because they're eating so much fish. And I think that's where really our research area started. So since the 1970s, I think there have been thousands and thousands of studies. In the end, there have been a lot more studies with fish oil because it's just easier to do, it's cheaper to do. But there have been quite a number of studies with seafood as well. And then what scientists do once we have a whole bunch of studies, we put them together. We have certain methodologies to put the results together. So it's rather than looking at a population of 500, you may suddenly look at a population of 500,000 because you pull all these studies together. And interestingly, we've seen recently, probably in the last decade, that the research pulled together that actually looked at fish consumption saw some very clear benefits from eating fish. So lower levels of cardiovascular disease, for example, and stroke. But if you look at those analyses that pulled all the fish oil studies together, they don't seem to find the same beneficial effect. So from those studies, it is very clear. It is actually the fish, not necessarily the fish oil alone, that gives you these health benefits.
That's interesting. When you mention vitamin D in fish, how do we take that in? Because my mind, we always associate vitamin D with the sun.
Yeah, it's a sunshine vitamin. And to be honest, that's where we get most of our vitamin D from, right? So, but we only get it in summer. So it's only between April and October that the radiation we get from the sun is in the right format that our skin can convert sunshine into vitamin D. But that means that you have to be outside, you have to kind of not necessarily be in the sun, you can just be outside for, well, at least a certain amount of time a day. It's like 10 minutes to 30 minutes. But not all of us are outside, right? We have busy jobs inside. Some people cover up because of religious reasons. There are people confined indoors. If you're elderly, you're in a home, you may not be outside that much. We have children that we cover in sunblock because sunshine is not necessarily good for you, especially when we have those fair skins here in Scotland. And then we have winter where we cannot make any vitamin D, and a lot of us become vitamin D deficient in winter. The estimate is about 70% of us, especially here high up north in Scotland. So that's why we are advised to take vitamin D supplements in winter. But they've shown in some countries that are even more north than we are, like Iceland, and they did a study in Tromsø, for example, that if you eat a lot of fish, this dip in vitamin D, which normally happens over winter, is not necessarily happening as much. It dips a little bit, but not as much as we dip here in Scotland, and Ireland was another study point. So it looks like if your fish consumption is high, you can prevent that vitamin D dipping in winter and you becoming vitamin D deficient. And that's important because, again, what I said, even in summer, some of us don't get a lot of sunshine. So it actually shows that actually eating fish is not only good because of its omega-3 fatty acid content, but also vitamin D content. And we also now know, because we did some research on it, it's also a really important source of vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is something that we normally get from red meat, for example, kind of from animal-derived protein. But arguably, we have to eat less red meat because it's not that good for the environment. And we need to source this vitamin B12 from somewhere else. And then fish could be a really important source for that micronutrient.
That opens some things in my mind that I've obviously been in the fishing industry all my life. I've been in all the Scandinavian countries, Iceland and around there. What you're referring to there, is that what's known as SAD, sunshine something deficiency?
I'm not sure. It may well have to do with the long winters as well. That because of the long winters and the lack of sunshine, that affects their physical well-being and sometimes also their mental well-being. And probably it's more referring to that area. But indeed, because of their long winters, they would be extra prone to vitamin D deficiency, but somehow they can counteract that by eating more fish, which is really, really good to see. And it's something that we can learn from, basically.
That's really fascinating to learn that. Do you feel there's a health benefit from eating fresh, locally caught seafood, locally as in the country you're in, rather than maybe imported or frozen or whatever?
Yeah, so I think generally, if you look at the nutrients that are in fish, so whether I get my salmon from here or from somewhere else, the nutrient composition when it's wild caught should be fairly similar. So there is not necessarily a benefit from a health perspective, from a nutrient perspective, but there are other benefits definitely. So one of the things is, for example, if you eat salmon that is farmed, if it's farmed in Scotland, it will be farmed on different feeding regimes than when it is farmed in Norway, for example. So in Scotland, we are known for putting a lot of fish oil, relatively a lot of fish oil in our fish feed. So as a consequence, the salmon will contain more omega-3 fatty acids, for example. But actually eating local is important for other things. And I'll mention an example. We did recently quite a big study in Aberdeen where we aggregated data on what we produce, all fish caught or farmed. We looked at what we imported, what we exported, but we also looked at what we consumed, what people were purchasing, and does it all align? Does it align with dietary recommendations? And we found actually that some of the oily fish that we produce, I already mentioned salmon, but we've got our herring and our mackerel as well, which are particularly high in omega-3 fatty acids and in vitamin D, vitamin B12, but also in selenium, which is another micronutrient which is important for our health. We produce a lot, so we actually have a lot of those nutrients available to our consumers. But what happens then is rather than that we are eating those fish, we export most out of the country. So we're not only exporting the fish, we are also exporting really valuable nutrients. We are exporting all of those omega-3 fatty acids and the vitamin D and the vitamin B12. So if we would just keep all that fish here and we would feed it to our people and there would be a demand for it because that's important, obviously, we could actually fulfill most of the dietary requirements for these nutrients in terms of omega-3 fatty acids, and we could fulfill almost half of vitamin B12 requirements for the whole population in the UK, but we export the fish. So if you kind of ask me, is it good to eat local? Actually, from a health perspective, yeah, it's good because it's an oily fish. It's rich in omega-3 fatty acids and vitamin D, but it's especially good for a sustainable perspective. Is that if we would actually eat more of the fish we would catch around in the waters around the UK, it would be good for our health and it would be good for sustainability as well because we're not exporting it out of the country. We're keeping it here.
That's so important because the statistics are crazy, because I think we export 80% of what we catch and import about 80% of what we consume.
I know, and I think that's down to consumers because we are very specific and we want what we want. We want cod and haddock for our fish and chips. Then we eat a lot of tuna for our tuna sandwiches. We have salmon and we eat prawns for the sandwiches probably as well. So these are what we call the big five. This is what consumers want. We're not producing the tuna, obviously. Most of the prawns we import. Cod and haddock, although we export, we import back into the country as well. It's just how trade works. Trade doesn't think about nutrients. Trade thinks about economic growth, right? And so those fish is what we eat, and that's what we mostly import. And then what we produce, kind of really valuable fish in terms of nutrients, herring, mackerel, salmon, it's all exported out of the country, sometimes up to 80%, which is really silly because we should try to eat that ourselves, really.
And in the health benefit from eating seafood, does it vary from one species to another?
It does to some extent. So fish generally is really healthy. So there have been, again, like one of these meta-analyses when you pull all the studies together, and they found that if you eat between 1, 2, or even up to 4 servings of fish per week, it doesn't really matter what fish that is, you reduce your risk of dying from heart disease by 20%, which is really quite a significant amount, right? If you think about this, up to half the people may die from heart disease. So this is really true for all fish, and that may well be because of the nutrients that are in fish. Or remember, like if you eat fish, you don't eat something else. So you may say it's like a replacement effect. We're eating fish instead of red meat, and perhaps fish is just healthier. So it's either because of the fish itself or something you're not eating instead. So that is for all fish. It doesn't really matter whether it's oily fish or lean fish or shellfish. Every fish contributes to that reduction in risk. But there was another study where they have looked at, if you eat fish, you eat omega-3 fatty acids, and these omega-3 fatty acids start floating around in your blood, and you can measure that. So if you eat more fish, your level of omega-3 fatty acids in your blood is higher. It's fairly straightforward. And we can measure the level of omega-3 fatty acids in your blood. We call that the omega-3 index. And the higher your omega-3 index, the less likely you are dying from heart disease or indeed any other disease. Again, up to almost 20% risk. It's slightly lower, 18%, I think. So, but because that is based on omega-3 fatty acids, which are mostly in oily fish, we feel that oily fish has that edge, has that advantage because it is much higher in omega-3 fatty acids. It's also higher in vitamin D because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. And again, fish is the most important dietary source of vitamin D. So that those two benefits are very specific for oily fish. But if you then look at at shellfish, for example, they are particularly rich in micronutrients, in iodine, selenium, in zinc, for example. So shellfish have a role to play as well, and lean fish as well. Kind of lean fish give us really important nutrients. And again, what I just told you, it's just not just eating the fish per se, it's also what you're not eating instead, because it replaces something that is potentially more unhealthy for you.
And is there omega-3 fatty acid in whitefish?
There is, but the levels are much lower. But that doesn't mean that like whitefish is a lot less healthier. It has less omega-3 fatty acids, it has less vitamin D, but it's still a lean source of protein. It's low in saturated fat. It has micronutrients that are important to our health. So it's still a really important choice from a health perspective, but also from, again, going back to sustainability, fish generally has more nutrients at a lower greenhouse gas emission cost, for example. So whether that's oily fish or lean fish or shellfish, it seems that it is always the better choice compared to some of the red meat or the lamb or pork equivalents in terms of nutrients and in terms of greenhouse gas emissions.
It's interesting when you talk about the micronutrients and that, because I remember looking at a scale. Now, I don't know what the scale was, but for zinc, it would score something like 5. For red meat, for a oyster, it would be 45.
Yeah, and I think some oysters specifically are really good for zinc, for example. And that's actually we should know more about, right? So especially as we age, we may need some more micronutrients to combat aging diseases. And then it's important to know that a fish is particularly rich in vitamin D, for example, or vitamin B12, or zinc, or selenium.
The other thing that to think back in years when from what you say about the oily fish is our parents, and from our parents going back, which you never hear of now, as the herring season was coming to the stage when the roe was forming, they would salt it, and that would be their diet over the winter.
Yeah, exactly. It was all about preservation and keeping it in stock for at later times when, like, we would normally not be able to catch the fish, right? And now we have big storage facilities. So we catch perhaps some of the fish only once or twice a year, and then we keep it in big storage facilities to keep it for the rest of the year. They had different ways of dealing with that, kind of obviously like a century ago when it was much more down to either fermentation or salting or other preservation methodologies.
Yeah, and when I look back and think of the importance of that, come the harvest time of the year, the village halls in the country would have what they called the harvest home, where there would be celebrations in the village halls and that bands playing and
Yeah,
dancing.
and I think yeah, it's very much kind of we've lost that a bit, isn't it? That food culture, the celebration of food, the harvest, and it's something that still happens. If you go to Iceland, you still have the herring festivals, for example, even though there's not like less herring coming in than it used to be, but those traditions still happen there. We sometimes I think we've lost that a bit here in the UK.
Well, I think we have, because even up until my probably 30s, when the farming fraternity would have their harvest home celebration, we would have the herring. And they used to call it here a tatty and herring night. But tatties, as you probably know, are potatoes. So that was the food for that night was tatties and herring. And
Exactly. Yeah.
so it was a celebration.
Exactly. And I think fish was much more part of our culture then, especially when you were living in coastal communities, because of fishermen being such a central kind of like element of communities, and often the wives being involved as well somehow in the preparation or in the preservation of the catch.
When I was a chef, I ran the kitchen in our restaurant when we had it. My wife Mary ran the front of house. I used to make in monkfish liver, and there's so many different stories I could speak about this, but from an economic point of view, it's something that's wasted. It's gutted and thrown over the side. You know, it's not kept because there's no market for it. But it was such a wonderful product, and I would just like to ask you, would there be a lot of health benefits in eating monkfish liver, considering cod liver oil, which is classed as a very healthy food? And going to the lake in Japan, they classed it as a superfood, and it was an absolute delicacy. And when they were Japanese people in the restaurant, they absolutely loved it. But
Yeah.
there's no market here for it.
No, and I think we are increasingly looking at what do we do with our discards, right? Because we are having to work with a circular economy. We want to waste less food, make sure that whatever we discard now is just going to be useful in some way. So interestingly, there has just been about 2 years ago a paper published, and the title is Fish Liver Discards as a Source of Long-Chain Omega-3 Fatty Acids. And they looked at the lipid content and the composition of the livers from 5 species that were relevant, including monkfish, including cod, hake, and ling, for example. And they found that actually it depends a bit when the fish is caught. So they say the fat content of the liver varies. So they have lower values of fat when it's caught in spring, in March and April, and they have higher values when it's caught in autumn, in October and November. But they also found that monkfish livers, although it does contain omega-3 fatty acids, as you say, it was actually lower than the other fish. So cod and hake and ling liver contained more omega-3 fatty acids. So in terms of commercial exploitation, I think that's how this paper was written. If you wanted to extract omega-3 fatty acids, then it's better to do it from cod or hake or ling liver. But if you wanted to consume it, then obviously the monkfish could still be a really kind of good alternative. Because what else are you going, if it's not enough perhaps to extract omega-3 fatty acids from a commercial perspective, it could still be served as a delicacy and still contain a reasonable amount of omega-3 fatty acid. And as well as vitamin D, I would think.
That's really interesting, and it makes sense to me. And presume the fact that there was less of the omega-3 fatty acids, I could picture that, because with the cod, ling, and I couldn't do what I did. I would take the monkfish liver, prepare them, take the veins out of them, and then wrap them into like sausage shape and steam them. They would be absolutely perfect, and they would be solid together, and you could cut through them once they had cooled down. I could never do that because they were too oily, and they would never, they would just disintegrate when I can understand that.
And I think kind of culture-wise, we're not really we are eating the big five I was just talking about, and we're not very experimental generally. If you go to Spain or even the Faroe Islands, right, they just eat a lot more parts of fish that they think tastes good, or there's a cultural link with it. And we are not very experimental, and in a way, that is a bit of a problem, because we need to move away from the current food system, which is, we know, not very good for us. We have obesity, we're not eating the right ingredients. But we also know through our studies that young people are a lot more experimental than older people. So I have still hope that perhaps the younger generation will pick up this old traditions and perhaps try them again, and from a food system perspective is able to use a lot more than what we currently use in terms of fish for consumption.
You see, when you mentioned earlier about the importing and exporting, obviously that is down to species by species, because we are importing the like of cod and haddock for our fish and chip shops mainly, but we're exporting maybe monkfish and a lot of the deep water fish to countries. Unfortunately, I hate thinking it and saying it, but they give them more value than we do.
Absolutely, and that's true. I mean, a lot of our exports go to Europe, to be honest, to France, to Spain, up to Russia, but increasingly to China as well. And it is indeed so much of our high value goods go somewhere else, because those people are used to kind of pay more for their fish. And yeah, we in the UK we are a big producer. We have a huge coastline, but the trade. So we are one of those countries that drive international trade, global trade in fish, and there's a huge global trade in fish. But it's not necessarily at the benefit for our own consumers, because a lot of fish are getting out of the country. And what we get back into the country is perhaps cheaper, but not necessarily healthier or kind of nutrient rich as some of the fish that we are exporting.
I'm always trying to beat the drum of fish and chip shops using more local UK cod fish. Would you be able to tell us, for people eating fish and chips, where obviously in a traditional fish and chip shop it would be, say, battered cod or haddock, they would still get the nutritional benefits from that, would they?
Absolutely. I mean, ideally you eat it without the batter, but that makes it attractive to the consumers. It's the same with fish fingers. I mean, children like the crumbs around the fish, and it's something we have been eating for a long time. It's actually, for some people, perhaps the only fish they eat, right? So they're not necessarily kind of big fish consumers, but they do eat fish and chips. So yes, the lean fish that is used for that, the cod and the haddock, they're still perhaps not taking the batter into account, a lean source of protein, still our protein source. It has got some omega-3 fatty acids, micronutrients, and vitamins. So it's still a good thing to eat, and it's unfortunate that we need to batter it in order for people to kind of make it a popular choice. Ideally, you just want to fry it or put it in the oven and have a dish like that. It would make it even better. But yeah, if the battering is actually making it acceptable to people, it's again, it's a cultural thing, isn't it? It's something that people have grown up with.
Very much so. Yeah, I've cooked many of them because we had a takeaway beside the restaurant that I used to cook a lot of battered fish. And it was actually, I felt, quite clever in a way, because although the batter was seen as the baddie in it all, if you had the temperature of the oil right and everything else was right and the batter was a proper consistency, the batter was protecting the fish, and the heat of the oil was actually steaming the fish inside the batter.
Yeah, and perhaps you don't lose as much of the fish oils that is in the fish as well, because it will probably maintain within the batter, I would think. But yeah, as I said, it's like fish is not just nutrients, it's also part of our culture and how we prepare it, and in which circumstances we eat it. And that's important too, right? We're not just eating food because of its nutrients. We're eating food because we like it, and it's perhaps reminding us of good old times, or it's just part of family traditions, and that is important to consider as well.
Yeah, would you say it's important, or how important for eating seafood to get all this vitamins and micronutrients?
Seafood helps a lot, and I already alluded to it. Obviously, some of the nutrients some of the micronutrients, some of the vitamins, think about vitamin B12 and selenium and zinc, we get them mostly through animal protein food. So think beef or pork or lamb. These are important sources of micronutrients, and that is important, especially for some groups, right? If I can think about adolescent girls, I can think about elderly, they have higher requirements for some of these micronutrients. And then if you're, for example, have certain lifestyle choices, you become vegetarian or vegan, then that may be healthy on the one hand, but you may then perhaps lack some of the nutrients as well at the same time. And as I said before, we have to kind of reduce our greenhouse gas emission. The best way of doing that is reduce our red meat consumption, reduce our lamb consumption. I think fish then becomes a really good alternative, but that hasn't really been discussed a lot in political debates or think tanks, or it's all about, perhaps we should go meatless for 3 days a week, or we should become vegetarian or vegetarian to some extent. And fish is actually left out of that discussion, whereas I think fish could be a really good alternative to red meat on 1 or 2 days a week, for example. And I think our research shows the same thing. Fish is an important source of nutrients, sometimes contains even more micronutrients or vitamins per 100 gram than meat does. And if you look at the way we catch the fish or we produce the fish, There are issues which are being looked into, kind of the trawling, for example, or which has become a lot better in the past years. We're looking at reducing the carbon emissions linked to trawling, to the fuel that's needed for the fishing industry. So we can produce it even with lower carbon emission than we're doing now already. And let's be honest, any food we eat has carbon emissions linked to it, right? Whether it's red meat or fish, or even some of the alternative proteins, the fake meats, if they're being produced, it has carbon emissions as well. I mean, there's not like any food we should eat to kind of save the world. Every food has a problem linked to it. But if you compare like for likes, I think fish is a really good alternative, which should be brought to the attention. And we should do more to see whether we can increase the consumption of fish. We've had dietary guidelines for almost 2 decades now to eat more fish. So in the UK, we should eat 2 fish, of which one should be oily. In Scotland, we say try to eat at least 1 oily fish. But a lot of people don't stick to it. And how do we actually get fish on the plate? Especially in those people who are not used to eating fish, right? And often we see that in groups that have a lower socioeconomic status, they're eating hardly any fish. And it's really important, especially for their health. So increasingly, we should think, and how can we actually put fish back onto the plate, not just only for our own health, but also for planetary health?
Yeah, I take it from what you've said up to now, like supplements you would recommend supplements if the diet wasn't available. Go for seafood first, say, but if it's a certain time of the year and it's not available or not at its best, then take supplements. Is that right?
I think generally when you have a healthy diet, and any nutritionist would say that you don't need minerals or supplements unless you are in some vulnerable groups. But generally, if you have a healthy diet, you don't need supplements or minerals. Like perhaps you need vitamin D over winter. That's actually an example of where we struggle to get enough of, especially during winter. But the thing is, like pragmatically, we're not all having good diets, right? So we could very pedantically say, oh, just stick to a healthy diet. You don't need supplements. But we're not necessarily all eating healthy diets. So I still think we should prioritize healthy diets over supplements, because if you look at fish, for example, I could eat fish or I could take a fish oil supplement. Actually, and I alluded to that already a little bit, if you look at all the supplement research together, there's actually very little benefit in terms of heart disease. And I pulled out a fact actually. So if you put all those studies together, and there are thousands of studies, quite a number, they conclude that fish oil supplements are probably not useful for preventing or treating cardiovascular disease. So, and this is an interesting fact, 167 people will need to take omega-3 supplements for around 4 years each, so that one of those people avoids a coronary heart disease event. So the efficacy is actually not very high. But then if you kind of look at fish, people that are eating fish, so if you're eating 2 fish a week, that lowers your risk of dying from heart disease by about 20%. So like from that perspective, it's much better to eat fish than to eat omega-3 fatty acids. And the whole reasoning behind it is that if you eat fish, it's not only omega-3 fatty acids you're eating a lean source of protein. It's not there's not that many calories in it compared to some other meat examples. You're getting vitamin D, you're getting vitamin B12, you get selenium, zinc, and probably that whole package together. And the fact that you're not eating something unhealthy instead. So you're replacing something unhealthy with fish. That may actually have a lot more impact. So from a nutritional perspective, we should really stick to the healthy diets rather than promoting supplements.
What's your views on ultra-processed foods? I read a lot about it, listen to podcasts, and they almost tell you if you want to lose weight, the worst way you can go about it is to diet.
So interesting about losing weight. I heard this from a friend of mine who was doing a Weight Watcher program, I think, and they had told her if it swims, it slims. And I think that is actually quite an interesting thing because fish, on average, like a serving size, contains a lot less calories than like an animal-based protein equivalent, and that like a land-based animal protein. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that saying, really. But in terms of ultra-processed foods, yeah, this has been on our radar for quite a while. To be honest, I think the media is overhyping it a little bit. From an academic perspective, ultra processed foods is a really big group of foods, and undoubtedly some of them are really not healthy. And those are often the foods that are high in salt, high in sugar, and high in fat, and they are mostly in that ultra processed group. But there are also foods in that ultra processed group that are not necessarily unhealthy. And I think to call them all ultra processed and it's bad for you, it's probably a bit unnuanced. And I think as academics working in the nutrition field, we feel that the media is really overhyping the ultra processed foods, and whereas perhaps we should focus more on those foods that are indeed rich in sugar, salt, and fat. And it doesn't mean we probably need a lot more research in it to kind of really understand what it does to you in terms of health and disease processes. But at the moment, I feel that predominantly the negative effects are caused by those foods that are high in salt, sugar, and fat, rather than just being cold ultra processed. And again, we could be pedantic about it, but in the end, if we want people to consume fish, we may need to process some of that, right? In order for people to make it palatable, to make it something that tastes nice. We're doing really inventive things with fish, right? I've a while ago I visited the international fish scanners, and they can fish, but they often make it taste really nice. They put some nice flavors to it, to the sardines and to the herring and the mackerel they put in their tins, and it's really good to put it in a salad or in your pasta. And if we want people to eat more fish, we may have to process some of that to make it palatable, or something that you can put in a microwave, because a lot of people don't have time to cook, although ideally you do, but not everyone has got that time or the skill sets to cook. And if you then have something that is prepared for you, so we would call that processed or ultra processed, but it contains a significant amount of fish or vegetables, it could still be a reasonably healthy option for you to eat.
I remember listening to one guy, and he reckoned when you mentioned their salt, sugar, and fat, refined sugar, he reckoned was more addictive than cocaine.
Yeah, we've had people doing research on food addiction. Apparently, it's different mechanisms involved. Like the mechanisms that gives you kind of the addictive addiction from cocaine is different from food, and as a consequence, apparently, we're not allowed to call it food addiction. But yeah, undoubtedly, kind of the food industry does know what makes food attractive, right? And often that means that they add some extra sugar to it, or some extra salt, or some extra fat, because that's actually what people like and that is what sells. So there is a demand for that type of food, basically, and that's what producers make.
Oysters and a fresh scallop. You could almost taste a sweetness.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Is that natural sugars, or?
I'm not actually sure, because there's not that much sugar in fish, and it's not the same level of sugar you would find in some fruits, for example. It must just be the mouth feel, perhaps a combination of different chemicals that give that sweet taste. But I agree, kind of sometimes it has like almost like a natural sweetness to it, isn't it? But
Absolutely.
there's not a lot of sugars in fish, so it must be kind of something else that kind of causes it to smell a bit sweeter,
Okay.
and taste a bit sweeter as well.
Yeah. Do you have any views on? I've heard people say that they reckon with farming, the way it's so intense, a lot of it is so intensely farmed now and almost forced fed because they want to get beasts to a size for marketing. They're forced fed and to increase weight so quick that they reckon there's almost no essential minerals left in the meat.
Yeah, actually, kind of intensive farming is a huge problem, probably more so for, I would argue, sustainability, right? So intensive farming means that we use land that we could use for other things to increase biodiversity. And because of intensive farming, either whether it's cattle or whether it is wheat production or other crops, it's not necessarily good for the environment. From a nutritional perspective, yes, there have been trade-offs. I would still argue that some of the meats are really important for our micronutrients that are quite unique to animals and animal production and animal consumption. But what I said already, I mean, fish is a really good alternative. And for many species, I think fish offers more micronutrients, more vitamins per serving at a lower carbon footprint than some of the meats do. So, but as I said, again as well, is that it hasn't really entered the discussions a lot. We are all talking about indeed perhaps having more environmentally ways of farming, but at the same time we have discussions of reducing our meat intake because it's not good for the environment the way we are producing our meat. But we really should be thinking about where do we replace the meat with? If we're eating less red meat, what we should eat instead in order to kind of make sure that we are getting all our micronutrients, and then fish is a really good alternative.
Well, you're making me feel quite good here because I've got good access to fantastic seafood. I probably have red meat maybe once a week, maybe, but I love seafood of some either shellfish, whitefish, four or five times a week.
Yes, I think my children have just left home, and we ate fish, but I think there was like a limit what we could do with the children, and now they've left home. We are sometimes eating fish almost every day or every other day or so. It is indeed. I'm from the northeast, so we have reasonably good access to fish fans and fishermen as well. And I remember, especially during COVID, when a lot of the fishermen couldn't actually land their fish and take it to restaurants, and they were looking for local markets, and we had somebody coming to our door to sell fish, and we had the most magnificent fish. So especially in coastal areas, we have access to some of the most amazing fresh fish there is, really. So yeah, and from a health perspective and a sustainability perspective, we really like to tap into that.
I don't know how close you are to fishermen, but a lot of them, they would be the lowest consumers of fish.
It's what they say about nutritionists, right? That they are often having the poorest diets, or the nurses that know all about health. And yeah, probably that is true. I think generally in the UK, we could eat a lot more fish for the fact that we are producing so much of it. So that is including the fishermen, I suppose.
We used to have a saying, cobbler's bairns. They used to call them. The cobbler was the shoemaker. His family, his children would have the worst shoes.
Exactly. Yeah, you always look at other people first, I suppose, to sell than to eat it yourself.
I remember my parents, we got it a lot. Would you say there's any credence to it when they would say, you eat lots of fish and you'll be really clever. You'll do well in school.
Yeah. Well, I've been to many conferences where this has been a really kind of hot topic to debate. Is fish really good for your health, even up to Alzheimer's, development of Alzheimer's, cognition? And there's a lot of controversy. Some studies show an effect, other studies don't show an effect. So we still don't know. We definitely know from a mechanistic perspective that the fish fatty acids, so we have got icosa pentaenoic acid, which we call EPA, or docosahexaenoic acid, which we call DHA. These are the main two omega-3 fatty acids. They are important for brain development. There's no doubt about it. So, and interestingly, there have been two studies which I wanted to mention. So there was in a Swedish study, they saw that school grades were higher in those who consumed fish at least once a week, independent of the parents' education, because often it's the parents' education that is important for how well your child does at school. But independent of that, they found that school grades were higher in those who ate fish at least once a week. And then there was a German study, and they found that fish intake was associated with the probability of increasing the final grade in German and mathematics. And I had German at school in the Netherlands. It was probably one of the toughest subjects I found, and the same with mathematics. So these were two challenging subjects. And so they found that children that were eating fish were better at getting good grades in these two subjects. I think that is interesting. So the thing is with nutrition research, kind of we look at the link between fish consumption and how well you do at school, for example. But there's lots of other factors that could kind of influence how well you do at school. So we always have to correct for that somehow in our studies, and that's not always possible. So, but I think, generally the consensus is that, fish, and especially some of the fish fatty acids, they are really good for brain development. And that can only be an advantage as we age, I suppose.
Would that be something to do with it developing the muscles around the brain?
Yeah, I think, brain development has different parts to it. It's not necessarily the muscles, it's just kind of how brain cells connect and communicate with each other. And for some reason, the fish fatty acids play an important role in how that develops and how that then subsequently functions. So we know there is a relatively large amount of these fatty acids in the brain, and that must be for a reason. And there's actually a really nice anecdote. This is kind of prehistoric research, archaeological research. They said that, like, as people evolved, right, and as we moved from land-based area towards the coast and got access to fish, it's only then when our brains really started to develop. And that's why, compared to other mammals and other species, we have a relatively large brain size. And one of the theories behind that is that because we moved from land-based communities to coastal areas and started to consume fish, that is really the period that our brains started to grow more than other mammals. So that's quite an interesting thing to think about.
That's very interesting. Could you explain to our listeners? I've heard it, I've felt it myself, and I've heard it from a lot of people. You're at a restaurant and you have a big steak and they come out feeling really bloated and full. But very seldom I ever heard anybody feeling that way if they've eaten fish.
Yeah, and I think it has mostly to do with the fact that fish has lower calorie content often. It depends a bit on how you prepare it, obviously, and what sauces you eat with it, and a lower fat content, so a lower saturated fat content. And especially when you have that for tea, your liver has to work hard to get rid of the calories, to get rid of the fat, especially because the more fat that is in your meal, the longer it takes for the stomach to empty it kind of into your intestinal system. So the higher the fat content, kind of it just starts to work slower. And I think that gives rise to the bloating effect. So coming back to the phrase, like, if it swims, it slims, it is just kind of a lower calorie option often to take in a restaurant. And that's one of the reasons I often take it in a restaurant, because it's a lower calorie option, equally tasty, and indeed you don't feel that bloated afterwards.
That's just takes something else to mind. Do you feel that could be a lot of benefits, or is there, from eating raw fish when it breaks down when you think of the gut and that?
I'm not necessarily sure. Sometimes, if you cook it, then actually it's easier for our system to cope with it. I don't think there's an awful lot of difference between people eating raw fish or eating processed fish or cooked fish, for example, in terms of how we metabolize it. But it's probably more a preference of taste, right? So if you go to some Asian countries, kind of raw fish is very popular on the menu, and it's something that's part of their culture, but it's also, they can do it because they have access to very fresh fish, because often these things you can only do it when the fish is really fresh, rather than when it has been in the supermarket, lying in the supermarket for quite a while.
Okay. I thought it was more to do with the enzymes that for the gut to help break it down, and sometimes if it was cooked, you lost that enzymes. They were cooked out.
I'm not aware, to be honest, of whether that's exactly how it works. So I couldn't really answer that question at this point in time. I would have to kind of look a little bit more into that.
I don't want to put you on the spot here, but the other thing that makes me think, when you mentioned earlier about when you were in the Netherlands, and they're not so much, I associate, if you asked me to shut my eyes and what do I think of when about eating when in the Netherlands, the first thing that would come to my mind is matjes, and that's not cooked.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
You know, you call it the matjes, the raw herring.
The raw herring. Yeah, but then, to be honest, although we market that really well, we don't eat, there's not a lot of people eating the raw herring, basically. But it's true. You're not cooking it. You put the onions, raw onions onto it, and that's how you eat it. But still, it's not that everyone in the Netherlands is eating the raw herring. It's actually probably a smaller percentage of the people eating it. But it is something that is marketed really well, to be honest, in the Netherlands. And let's be honest, I think the Netherlands is exporting a lot of their herring like we do in the UK to other countries as well.
My perception was that it was like a national dish, and I was a bit of a wimp if I was out there and I didn't do it.
To be honest, yeah, no, it is definitely something that people eat, especially if you live in that coastal area. But it's not something I grew up with, that's for sure.
Okay. Well, taking that the next stage, if you were sitting down for a special meal, would it be seafood? And what would be your choice and favourite?
Yeah. I will definitely, if I would go to a restaurant, like probably 9 out of 10 times I choose fish, because they often offer something that I may not have access to it, or I cannot make as nice as home. So my favorite would be halibut when it's in season. It's not in season very long, but if it's in season, I really like the halibut or lemon sole, and I like scallops as well. I think you already referred to the sweetness, and you can combine it with some really interesting other things. So those two options would definitely be my favorite. Often the scallops are offered for a starter, isn't it? And then the halibut for a main meal. So that would be my perfect meal.
Or would you, I take it you wouldn't batter it or breadcrumb it?
No, not necessarily. I mean, sometimes it comes like that, but no, I wouldn't actually take fish and chips very often in a restaurant because I sometimes feel there's more batter than there is fish, and I would often put the batter aside just because I'm a nutritionist and I know what's in it, I suppose. So no, I like the fish fried definitely. I was in a restaurant yesterday and I had fried cod and it was made with an Indian tandoori sauce and it was absolutely delicious. It was a bit of a twist to a very Scottish meal and it was amazing. So yeah, even something like cod, which we normally associate with fish and chips, can be made really nicely. Kind of when you fry it and you put it in a nice sauce and put some nice vegetables through the sauce. It can be really really nice.
That sounds really good. And cod is fantastic for putting with different sauces or different
Absolutely.
accompaniments.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Absolutely. Yeah. You're right.
Although we're very traditional as far as our eating is concerned in the UK, I think you could almost take it down to if it's not cod or plaice, you wouldn't sell it in England. And it's the same in Scotland. If it's not a haddock or a lemon sole,
Yeah. Exactly. I think we definitely have our favorites, isn't it? And that's what people stick with.
yeah. Oh, totally. But it's good that it is, from a fishing industry point of view, it's good that it's fish they are eating. And definitely, I'm really interested to hear how you feel the health benefits people could have from increasing their fish diet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know about it, but ideally you want people to eat fish because they like it, right? Not necessarily. It is healthy, obviously, and it is sustainable, but you want people to like it as well because that's the only way they will eat it more often.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated talking to you earlier, and you mentioned about the fish cultures and the herring. You called it the herring girls, where we
Yeah,
used to call them the fishwives.
yeah. It's I obviously I don't have any cultural connection with them because I only came to the UK in 1999. But I've read some amazing stories about a group of really, actually, very influential, powerful women. Right, these were often the wives of the fishermen, and the fishermen would start in the north and worked from Shetland all the way down to Lowestoft, and they would then the fishermen would bring in the fish and the wives would be there to process the herring and they formed a really important link between obviously their husbands, the fishing industry, and then making that fish available to often the coastal communities because it was just sold locally in markets. But it was going to fish markets as well. It would go to Billingsgate in London, and it is. And these women had like a really powerful kind of role, and that's like they accepted the fish and then they processed it, they cured it, and it was like a community. These women knew each other. They would cure the fish, they would cure the herring. And I've seen some amazing pictures of when there was no herring, they would just knit, or it was a really powerful community. And interestingly, I read recently that this did not only happen in Scotland and the rest of the UK, it happened in other Nordic countries as well. And in Iceland, for example, they had this herring girls or fishing wives that had the same role. And they think, at the moment, if you think about Iceland, it's probably one of the most equal countries in terms of men and women rights. And they get that back to the time there were these herring girls or the fishing wives having such an important role in the community. And they maintain that importance in society more generally. And that's why at the moment it's probably one of the most equal countries in the world. And I find these stories fascinating and interesting to see how these women fulfilled such an important role in what used to be a really commercially important industry, the fishing industry.
It makes me think back when you mention it, and they were strong, not just physically strong, but they were really strong characters. Invariably, maybe the husband, he would be a fisherman, and he would be more maybe laid back, standing back a bit, and the herring girls, fishwives, whatever we call them, they would be the decision makers.
Yes. Again, it just shows the important role they played in society at that point in time, being an absolutely instrumental part of the whole fishing industry and how they made their money and how they actually kind of fed the nation in a way, kind of with like an important healthy food. So yeah, it's really interesting to read about it and to see the pictures that are still in archives, that are still in museums. Really fascinating.
Totally. And one of the things that I often think, because I salt herring each year and in the season and give it away to people. Sadly, I have to mention it's all older people who take it. There's no young people interested in it. So when I do it, or when I'm doing it, salting them and taking the gut out, I'm often horrified thinking what a wimp I am, because when you look at the old videos and photos, the speed they worked at compared to what the speed I would be working at. And also, they would be working with the fish, the salt, in their bare hands.
Absolutely, their bare hands. And kind of, can you imagine the pickled kind of environment they had to work in, right? And even just, if you look at their aprons, it was just kind of grey of just the saltiness. And it was a really hard-working community. But I think there was a lot of fun and a lot of kind of people were taking care of each other. It was just really a community, and they looked after each other. And it's fascinating to see how that has evolved. And at some point, it was just gone when the herring fishing actually kind of ceased, kind of in the 1940s, 50s. That whole group of women probably just lost their job as well, and like had a different part to play in society from then onwards.
Totally. But they had lots of fun. I can even remember my own grandmother when I was younger saying how much happy times they had on all the different ports they would have been. And like you said, they would be from Shetland to Lowestoft over the year with the difference, how the season changed.
Yeah.
They would move with it.
Exactly. So yeah, that's not something kind of we travel now globally, but actually to have such a community traveling together is just a really interesting fact.
Thinking of that, would you say they obviously followed the season? Would you say, in the nutritional point of view, seasonality is important?
We see kind of small changes in fish composition across seasons. It's not massive, right? Obviously, sometimes with spawning, and you do see that the fat content goes up and down. And I just alluded to that in that one study as well. So yeah, you see some differences in fat content throughout the year. And we also looked at that from a fisheries management perspective. What is the best season to catch fish if you want to optimize nutrients? So if for example, at the moment we fish to maximal sustainable yield, but we can also kind of fish to maximal nutritional yield. And there are differences. So for some nutrients, it is better to fish in winter. For other nutrients, it's better to fish in autumn, for example, if we look at some of our local catch. But it's like the differences are not huge, but there are some differences.
It's fascinated me talking to you, and one of the things that I find is loud and clear with all the things you mentioned about the micronutrients, the vitamins and low fat, everything you've mentioned is when we talk about health, we need to be talking more about food rather than a tablet or a capsule.
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about health, it should be from a very young age, right? It's not like once we're in our 40s and we suddenly we find out we have a high blood pressure or high cholesterol levels or high glucose levels. And then you think, oh, I have to do something about my diet. Actually, we really want people taking in healthy foods from a very young age, from when they're children. Because if you look at some of the foods our teenagers eat, that's not very good either. And if you kind of introduce fish in families from a very early age, you're much more likely to continue eating fish later in life as well. And we have probably parts of our population that hardly eat any fish, and it's really making that accessible to bigger parts of the population, not only when you're older, because we know that the older people are eating a lot more fish than the younger generations. And it's really kind of how do we get our youngsters to eat more fish? And that's where some of our research is focusing on as well. How can we just make it commonplace in primary schools and perhaps in families with young children? How can we introduce fish there?
And when you were doing this studying and the work, where would your findings go?
So we try to disseminate in different ways. Obviously, we have our academic journals, so we communicate as academics and we show each other our results, and that's publicly available. I've got my website, my LinkedIn, where I announce certain events I may be talking at, or we work with stakeholders, with organizations like Seafood Scotland or Seafish, or I have worked with kind of fish farms, for example, and try to disseminate that way. We can sometimes disseminate together with them. I speak with Scottish Government. So we have the Marine Directorate, which looks at seafood policies, and they look at our data and we explain what we have found and how that may affect policies, especially now in relation to Good Food Nation policies, for example. So we try to disseminate at different levels. We've also prepared a tool where people can interrogate our data so they can see kind of how much fish did we produce in the last 10 years, every year, how much did we import, how much did we export, how much did we eat. We have that tool available. So if people would be interested in this type of research or in the data, they can always contact me, and I'd be more than happy to have a phone or like internet conversation with them, or we can meet, or we can look at organizing events together.
It came to my last point was where can people follow you online?
So if they look me up at the University of Aberdeen or the Rowett Institute, they can find where I am and what I'm doing, and we take it from there.
Well, I would just like to thank you so much for everything you've said today, and it really has been everything I was hoping for and expecting. I think it's fantastic what you've said about the nutritional value of our fish. Thank you so much today.
Well, and thanks for inviting me to your podcast. It's for us also a really important way of disseminating what we're doing to a much wider audience. So thanks for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you.